Great. Thanks, Ash. Thanks for your help. Appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. Thanks to the number 4 Journal Club issue, I guess. I don't know if it's an issue. What is it, Phil? It's not an issue. It's a
cast. It's a cast.
Cast. Okay.
Episode.
Episode. That's good. Episode is even better. Yeah. The 4th episode of our Journal Club. I think we've got a great Journal Club going tonight. We have my favorite co-host. I feel you're right below me on my screen. I don't know where you are on. This is kind of like the Brady Bunch. I don't know where everyone's at. Am I right above you?
Below me.
Am I above you? I'm below you. Oh, you're below me. Okay. Well, my favorite co-host. I'll introduce him real quick. Phil Page. Phil, just tell everybody quickly about yourself, please.
Hey, everybody. My name's Phil Page. I'm associate professor and research director at FRANU DPT program in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Thank you, Phil. I didn't mention I'm Rob Mansky from the Department of Physical Therapy at Wichita State University. Go Shockers. Our guest host today, we have an excellent guest host. Everybody loves this guy, the General, George Davies, over on my bottom right. George, introduce yourself real quick, please.
Hello, George Davies. I'm a professor at Georgia Southern University in Savannah, Georgia. And we're looking at the Weather Channel on the side because the hurricane is approaching. We've already canceled classes for tomorrow and for Friday. But quite frankly, I'm honored to be on this Journal Club, primarily because of the main character that we're featuring tonight being Wendy. Wendy is actually a former UW lacrosse student from years ago. And so again, I'm so proud of any students who have tremendous accomplishments. And Wendy is, I think, really exemplified that, going on and getting her PhD, becoming a director of a program, and now, importantly, publishing and sharing information so other therapists can do a better job with their clinicians. So I'm honored to be here and so proud of what Wendy has accomplished.
Thank you. We're glad you're here, George. And this, believe it or not, this was just coincidence that Wendy had went to school. I had picked these articles and asked George to be our guest host before I even knew anything about Wendy, even knowing George or having any affiliation with the university there. So I think we'll start with Wendy. Let me read the title of your paper here real quick here, Wendy, and then you can tell us about yourself and the authors, and then quickly let us know just a synopsis of your paper, okay? And Wendy's paper with some of her co-authors is Lower Kinetic Chain, Meet the Thinking Brain, a scoping review of cognitive function and lower extremity injury risk. So Wendy, please tell us about, you can, I guess, tell us about your other co-authors, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then give us a synopsis of your paper, please.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. Rob, thank you for the invitation. And George, it's so great to see you. And thank you for your kind words. They mean so much. So it's great to have this opportunity to see you. As both Rob and George said, I am the program director of the Doctor of Physical Therapy program here at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I'm also the director of the Visual Motor Lab here at UWM. I am one of those, I'm going to use the word unique physical therapists, in that my clinical practice is in orthopedics, and I was board certified for 10 years before I joined academia. But my PhD is in cognitive neuroscience, and actually did my postdoctoral work in Germany working with monkeys. So I really have 2 arms of my research in my lab. I have a translational arm, which is really looking at the role of cognition in injuries, particularly in the lower extremity, although we also do look at the upper extremity. And then I have another arm where we do all neuroimaging, functional neuroimaging, where we're really trying to understand the neurophysiological underpinnings of attention so that we can look for a biomarker to be able to predict people's performance or recovery from injury. So that's a little bit about me and what I do.
Thank you.
Did you have a question, Rob?
No, I just say thank you for letting us know that. That's pretty, that's like a little over my head, I'm afraid. But I appreciate you telling us. I can't wait to get talking about your article.
So my co-authors, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee is an R1 institution. So we have a 3-semester research sequence. And so this project, 4 of the authors are now graduated physical therapists working out in the field. And one of them is a current first year who really got the the paper over the finish line so that we could get it published. So all of the other authors were students in our program when this work was done. And then they chose to continue with the project into their third year when they were out in the clinicals because they felt so strongly about it. So definitely have to give kudos to them. They spent a lot of hours on this project. As you saw, scoping review of 56 articles, that's a pretty big undertaking, and the students did a fantastic job.
Yeah. So I guess I'll start with some of the questions, and then Phil, George, feel free to hop in with any questions you have or comments if you want to add to anything Wendy talks about related to the article. But Wendy, this is it's not completely new, I guess, cognitive function in the lower extremity and the upper extremities, but it's really kind of become kind of a new hot, sexy topic in rehab, in orthopedic and sports rehab specifically. So can you tell us on your opinion of kind of like why this evolved this way, and kind of when did it start and when did it really take off?
So if you look at the 56 papers that we included in this study, we went back to 2000. So we looked at studies over the last 21 years. And if you plotted when these papers were published, they really started in earnest in 2016. So there were dribbles here and there. There was the Swanwick paper in 2007. There were a couple papers before that, but really 2016 and then more recently is when this became much more of a topic. And I think that three things really contributed to that. One, we started to really look at concussion more closely and the impact of concussion on injuries. And I don't think we were doing that before the mid-2010s in earnest. And so I think that that was one body of literature. I also think that our models of ACL injury were very much biomechanical. So we were looking at loads putting on the ligament. And then we started to get into some motor control things, but really a lot of models now are looking at including psychological factors, motivation. And so then I think cognition naturally became a part of that. So I think that that was the second one. And then the motor control, just the fact that people started to think more about control issues, that naturally brings the brain into the equation.
Yeah. Can you tell me, as I was reading this, you mentioned the capacity model of attention. Can you describe that a little bit, maybe for everybody, so that maybe everyone will understand a little better what you're talking about and how that relates to lower extremity injury in context to this article?
So I do have a paper in revision right now being reviewed, and it talks about the capacity model of attention. So if there's any potential reviewer out there, I want you to know that that revision went in before this conversation. So get that out there. So we all have a limited capacity, and our capacity across the 7 of us is all very different. And so if you think of capacity as being a pitcher of water, and then all of the task demands. So if we take a basketball scenario, I think, Rob, you and I played basketball, right? We played not against each other. Although
No.
I am from Wichita. So
You are from Wichita?
Yeah.
Oh, did you tell me that?
Yeah, we talked about, you actually know a Huddleston.
Yeah.
Below or above a Huddleston, yeah.
Archie.
So so if we take basketball as an example, we have the ball. We have to attend to the hoop. We have to attend to the defensive players. We have to attend to the offensive players. And there's crowd noise, hopefully cheering for your team. And then you also have to come up with a strategy to dribble the ball, pass the ball, shoot the ball. And so if you think of all those different components of the task as a cup, and we have this finite set of resources, if there are a lot of cups on the table, I can only pour a little bit of water in each one of those cups, right? Or I need to learn how to put more water in this bottle so that I can fill those cups up more, right? And so some people naturally have full cups and other people have shorter cups. And our lab hypothesizes that in the case of concussion, the amount of water in the cup is diminished. And that's why we're seeing those lower extremity injuries again.
Yeah, good. Do you guys have any questions? I can keep, I've got a host of questions I'm happy to ask, but I don't want to steal your guys' time. If you have questions, Phil or George.
I think related to what you just said, and it was on your question list, actually, because both of you played basketball. And one of the things that's almost everybody's doing some of the neurocognitive training or whatever, they keep mentioning this concept of counting backwards from 100 by serial sevens. And again, the problem when Rob was playing basketball, he was trying to do that, but he had to use his fingers to count. Consequently, he couldn't dribble the ball.
I kept
or even
traveling.
shoot it because
You weren't supposed to tell that, George. That happened all the time. My coaches used to get so angry. Why are you counting? No, good. That's funny. All right. Well, so Wendy, let's talk about standard capacity then. You talk about that in your paper too. And what I was wondering was, as I was reading this and trying to really digest this, does that have anything, does the standard capacity, does that have anything to do with your, like, I was wondering, does that have to do with anyone's actual like IQ? And, you know, some people are obviously brighter than others. And or the other question I was wondering was, does like just other things that take up mind capacity, like a high school kid with grades, or, you know, having girlfriend problems, or his parents are mad at him, that kind of stuff. Does that take some of that capacity, or is that mental capacity different than your standard capacity for physical function?
So that is a question that would require a very large beverage to answer. And so I'm going to try to answer it short, but I love the question. So in my lab, we really focus on attention, but attention is only one part of cognition, and it's only one part of intelligence. And so there's memory, there's numerosity, there's all sorts of other things that fall in that category. Now, your specific example of girl troubles, that actually affects the brain a little bit differently. So it doesn't affect how much capacity is in the cup, but it affects how well you can pour the water out of the cup. And so reward, potential punishment, intention, all actually changes the neural signaling and how that is processed more than it changes the capacity itself. The functional outcome is exactly the same. So there are a few studies, and actually a great study came out just this last year, and they looked at attentional capacity and intelligence and found that they actually did co-vary. So you could explain almost up to 50% of people's intelligence scores based on attentional capacity.
Wow. Yes, that's what I wondered.
So yeah, that's why attention is important.
Yeah. And George, I know you want to bring up my not being able to count backwards. You don't need to bring up my like high school and college girl troubles. We don't need to bring those up today. Okay. There's certain things that really is kind of off it's taboo for this journal club.
we don't have enough time. Wendy, can you change that capacity? You keep using your cup. Can we change that? And if so, how?
Well, if you give me money. So that is the direction of our lab. So that is where our grants are going. So that question is not very well answered. So there was a systematic review that came out in 2021 and looked at dual task training. And we haven't talked about that yet. But in the short term, adding that second task really affects mechanics, particularly lower extremity mechanics, even more than upper extremity mechanics. In the long term, you can actually increase capacity. Now, that was a systematic review of only 18 papers, and only 5 of them looked at long-term effects. So we need a lot more data. There was a German group that published probably 4 or 5 years ago now, where they looked at athletes. And so, and the first paper was athletes as well. They actually looked specifically at if we can improve attentional capacity. And they used ecologically valid tasks. So they used cutting, passing, dribbling kind of tasks. And they did a second study where they used neurocognitive tests on a computer. So Stroop, trail making, some of those other tests. And both of them had a benefit to increasing capacity. And that capacity, that increased capacity could carry over to sport. And so Rob's question about counting backwards playing basketball, that's not something we actually do. it ends up that it doesn't matter how we make our cup bigger. Now, if I only had a sponsor, like Eddie Bauer doesn't sponsor me, but I keep holding this cup up, so I should have had a sponsor on my cup. But if we increase that capacity on the next task, it doesn't matter how we use it. If we increase it in any way possible, we'll still have more resources.
Good.
Just recently, out of Dustin Groom's lab, they actually did the change of direction test. Then they basically did the change of direction test for the dual task. And they showed that it decreased the performance by about 10%. That's one of the first studies that's sort of looked at that, as you said, Wendy, something that's sort of reflective of ecological validity, a cutting maneuver going side to side, and then adding that dual task factor. And that was just published recently.
Yeah.
So again, I'm almost curious, even though we can increase the capacity, when you start adding more, as you said, you get an adrenaline dump, you've got to respond to the opponent, you get all these other variables going on. Even though you can increase the capacity, how is that going to ultimately influence the output, i.e. performance?
Right.
So boy, oh boy, talk about a complicated, convoluted question. There it is.
And the methodology is tricky because you can't control everything. And
Exactly.
cognition is so big that, like, what part of it do you actually challenge? And some of the newer motor control theories, the optimal theory, is really talking about adding dual tasks, but you really have to add them in a progressive way. But I think the days of us not challenging them and just really in that sterile clinical environment, having them really focus on their mechanics, I think those days are done. We have to be gradually challenging them to increase that capacity.
Yeah, so that was another question I had, or kind of related to that. I think if like most, and George, you can answer, Phil, you can answer this question too, I guess, or give your input. Most of these tests that we've done, I mean, I've written Mike Raymond and I wrote a book on functional testing methods, and almost all the functional testing methods till now have been really single cognitive tasks. Jump as far as you can, hop as high as you can, jump as high as you can, run to this cone and come back. And we have normative values for a lot of those that we use when we treat our patients and we're doing research. So now, throwing this whole second, double cognitive issue into it totally throws all those values out the window. So do we not use those anymore? Do we not use the test we've been using for 25, 30 years? Or do we still use those, but try to start gathering more data with multiple tasks?
What I think something is interesting, and JOSPT recently, there was that Berne consensus on all the functional tests for the shoulder. Every one of those was a proactive test. None of them were reactive. In August 22, 2022, the AAOS just came out with the new recommended guidelines for ACL. 23 tests. None of them are reactive tests.
Yeah, see?
And we actually, Phil, Rob, and I, and several others were at the OSET meeting this past weekend, and I presented some of that. But what's really interesting, back to Rob's question, there's a lot of this stuff that's being published with these recommendations, and none of them are reactive, which I find interesting. We actually just submitted two abstracts to APTA CSM, where we're doing neurocognitive reactive closed kinetic chain testing, upper extremity, and the neurocognitive reactive open kinetic chain testing with using blaze pods on a response. But what I'm leading up to for a question for you, Wendy, when I presented some of that stuff at a meeting, somebody asked me, well, do you think we should train offensive versus defensive players differently? Because they're really totally different in what they're doing. Even though the offensive player is going to sort of react to the opponent, the defensive player has to do even more reactive responses. So that's another whole element. What are your thoughts on that? Being an ex-athlete and all that, and doing everything that you're doing now from a research standpoint.
And so what I know of the ACL injury literature for non-contact injuries in soccer players is they're getting hurt on defense and not on offense. And so there is a difference. I don't think that that shows up in basketball, but it shows up in soccer. And so to me, that alone is evidence that it's a different skill set. It's a different cognitive load for offense versus defense for at least some sports.
Because typically your offensive person knows the route they're going to run.
Yep.
Whereas as a wide receiver, as an example, whereas the defensive person has to respond to all of that.
Yeah.
So that may be a big factor, as you said, adding additional cognitive load,
Right.
of trying to have additional responses.
Yeah.
Interesting
sport,
question.
Yeah, it is, because any sport that has some kind of planning to it, like strategy for offense versus defense, it's like exactly as you're saying. Yeah, it's less reactive offensively than defensively.
And as you said, that book that you published on all the functional testing, again, they're all proactive. You're going to do this. You're going to do a hop test, a triple hop, a crossover hop. And again, I always come back to that word, and Wendy mentioned it before. I love the word ecological validity. It doesn't really replicate the real world context. And you really have to question
it did when we published that thing, George. That was when we published it. That was the best we knew. We weren't doing this stuff back then.
Right.
So that just tells me we need a revision.
I think you're right.
Yeah. It's been
Another
a while.
book for Mansky.
Another book. Yeah. Another book.
You only have a dozen out so far.
No, I know.
So come on, let's ramp it up, buddy.
One more. Phil, did you you were starting, I think, ask a question.
Yeah, after I listened to George's talk, which is always awesome, and always learn something new with George. And what he just said was my take-home message of proactive versus reactive testing. And as I got to thinking, it was very timely with this paper. And as I'm looking at the title, I'm thinking, and the title says thinking. It's not about thinking. It's about sometimes reacting. We don't want to have to think, right?
Right.
And so my question, Wendy, was of all of these tests, and I'm not familiar with all of them, but can you then define a test by being proactive or reactive, or are there any reactive tests or components that you came across?
So, so there are. So the blaze pods are one, and those are pretty new out. So I don't know of a lot of research on those. But I think for the reactive tests, so a PhD student of mine who is a PT professor now at Trine, who was at La Crosse, actually, George, for a while.
Yep.
When he was with me, he was doing standardized tests. So Rob, going back to your question, he was doing standardized tests, but then adding a second component that added validity to it. So he put a basketball in their hands. He had them having to do a pass after they did a forward jump. And so I don't know that we actually have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It may just be that we need to add a second task to those functional tasks, because in research, as much as we would like to be ecologically valid all the time, that becomes very difficult to control. And so if we have a standardized set of tests, but we add the second component to it, that may be sufficient. Phil, to answer your question a little bit further for upper extremity, one of my colleagues at York University up in Canada has actually developed a tool because she works with hockey players across the spectrum. Of course, it's Canada. And so what she has found is that return to play is people will pass return to play tests if you test them cognitively alone and then you test them motorically alone. But when you test them together, they shouldn't have gone back to play. And so she's developed a tool where you're actually testing those things together and shown that recovery is a lot longer when you're further challenging them. So I think that there are some things out there, but I don't think they're standardized as far as the reactive tests. And that's going to be Rob's next book. Maybe we can collaborate, Rob.
Yeah.
So, because I think we do have to have some accepted practice in order to actually advance the profession. I don't think we can just go out in Wild West and just having people do everything. It makes it really hard to interpret the data.
Yeah, it would. And it would be hard to determine whether someone was really I mean, that's what I guess the other question is. So you add that other component and you get a score. What is that score telling me? And how do I know if that means they're ready? So George said the study that showed a 10% loss or 10% deficient score. Is 10% deficient score acceptable, or is it not acceptable? What is acceptable? When we test them with a dual task, what score do we need to see? When it's safe, when do we think it's safe for them to go back to doing their activity?
Well, and I think that we actually have ways to measure that. So, so what Gus did in my lab is he actually looked at how the mechanics changed when he added that second task. And I think that we do know enough about the biomechanical risk factors for ACL, for example, so that we can say, okay, in this population, at this age group, a 10% is too much versus maybe novice people who are practicing or playing at a recreational level, there's more variation. And so maybe they're okay. But an elite performer, having them decline 10%, that's a big
That's
deal.
a lot. Yeah.
So of course, the answer is always going to be, it depends. And, you know, I don't think we can have one size fits all, but I think that we do have the tools in place. We just haven't done the work yet.
Yeah, that's probably true. That's probably true. So Wendy, I have one more question, and this I think is a good one to kind of wrap this whole segment up with, unless anybody else has another one. But this is one that I kind of sent you, and it's like I said, I was going to be kind of devil's advocate in that, you know, when we're doing these tests, you know, you're having them count backwards, or you're having them look at a color or something like that. And you mentioned there are certain things that you do while you're playing basketball or while you're playing football, but the things that you're doing typically in a lab cognitively, I mean, when I'm playing basketball, although George said I did, I'm not usually counting backwards from 7. I'm not looking at colored cards with different numbers and or adding, subtracting, or multiplying. I'm just playing basketball. So how does doing those tests, even if you're doing a functional test and throwing up a card, that's not really what I'm doing while I'm playing the sport. So how does that really translate to improved cognition during sport? And can we actually prove that doing that actually helps during that sport and not just, you know, while I'm doing it in the lab for research purposes?
So to answer that question, I'm going to go back to George's book on isokinetics back in the day.
Well, that's an old one.
Late 80s. And one of the things that he showed in that book is that if you train someone at a specific velocity, it doesn't carry over to another velocity, right? You had to train them at different velocities because you didn't get, there was a 10-degree window, 10 degree per second window for that to carry over. And we've learned that, right? We can't do something in the clinic and expect that to carry over. So, you know, we're shooting hoops with our patients. We're looking at their golf swing. Because we have to have them practice what they're going to do. Your mindset is coming from that philosophy. For the capacity, for the attentional capacity, it seems that it's robust enough that anything we do to increase our capacity will allow us to have more resources when we carry it over to a different task. So it doesn't look like we have to do the exact same thing that we do in sport in order to increase that capacity. And that's why it has to be
something that challenges them.
Yeah, just counting backwards just works that mental muscle, if you will, that allows us then at the next step, when we are back on the basketball court, we actually have more resources to look at the defenders or whatever.
Good. Great answer. Thank you. Someone just sent a question here. Can we train them to change their TRTD with training?
That's the acronym for time rate of torque development from Davies' book way back in the early.
Oh, someone else has your book?
80s.
Oh, wow. There's 2 people that have your book.
It's the same as force development accuracy or rate of force development or right torque acceleration energy or TRTD, time rate of torque development. All those terms are synonymous with the reactive time. Can you train quickly enough to be able to react to the opponent, I think is what the question is asking. And not only respond, but can it be quickly enough to respond appropriately?
I don't know that I know the answer to that. That isn't in my wheelhouse. I would suspect you can, but that's just a wild guess.
Yeah.
And I think a good example, somebody can be very strong, but if they're not powerful, they can't generate the force quickly enough, then it's of limited value. And I think that was the basis of that question, I guess.
Right.
It probably depends on, my guess is it would depend on the training type. Yeah.
Sure.
And you probably could. Yeah, because you
specificity.
can train power, so you should be able to train
Sure.
rate of torque development. Yeah,
Sure.
Right.
good.
Specificity training.
Exactly. Well, thank you, Wendy, very much for joining us tonight and sharing your article and answering all these great questions that we had for you. We appreciate you joining us.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you again for selecting this article, and it was a great conversation. So
Great.
thank you for that.
You're welcome. And Wendy,
Thank
you're
you.
more than welcome to hang on while we talk to Angel about his study, and you can join and ask questions and answer. If you know some answers, just join in the fun, I guess. Right?
Yeah,
All right, so
I'm staying. It's
great,
super
great.
interesting.
Our next paper is by Angel Ceballos.
There you
Did I
go.
get it right, Angel? I did,
Yes,
didn't
you
I?
did.
Ceballos.
Yep.
It's a resident case series, blood flow restriction as an adjunct to strengthening exercise in 2 patients with subacromial impingement and high irritability. So Angel, just like Wendy did, can you tell us just a little bit about yourself and just briefly talk to us about your study, and then we'll do the same thing we did earlier and ask some questions.
Awesome. Sounds good. No, I appreciate you guys having me on. It's been fun so far. So we'll see if you guys keep it easy on me. My name is Angel Ceballos. I am the sports PT at the University of Toledo. I completed my sports residency at the University of Florida between 2020 and 2021. So about a year ago now. That's kind of where this paper comes out of. It was part of our research to complete for the residency. And so the resident prior to me, Matt Miller, he actually wrote or published a paper similar to mine, but it looked into strength values in overhead athletes and kind of the effects that BFR has on that. Kind of like you mentioned in one of your questions, it's a topic that really hasn't been touched upon a lot. I think the upper extremities have been kind of excluded a little bit in the BFR literature. I know we see a lot of lower extremity being covered in terms of ACL, and there's a couple that look into the Achilles tendon, but there really isn't a lot in terms of overhead athletes or even just generalized upper extremity. And so we felt that this was something that we wanted to take a look at, and specifically, we wanted to look at the effects that BFR has on pain, because we have seen clinically some changes in pain sensitization or pain sensitivity in the lower extremity, in particular, like our patellar tendinopathies and our patellar tendon patients, our ACLs who have patellar tendon grafts. And so it was something that interested me. It's BFR has been something that I've sort of been doing some work in terms of research since undergrad and in PT school. And so it was just something that we felt would be kind of new and cool to see if there were any changes.
Yeah, it's great paper, 2 great cases. And this is a really good, I mean, I really like this because we see patients a lot of time with this exact diagnosis that have fairly high irritability. They have high levels of pain. They have decreased range of motion, decreased strength, whether the strength is decreased because of pain inhibition or if it's actual true weakness or not. A lot of times, I don't think we know. And but using blood flow restriction in this manner, they could use a lower load and hopefully still get the same strengthening benefits. So I really like this paper, and I like the fact that you're looking at this population. What do you guys think, Phil, George? Did you think the same? Or
I thought it was an interesting, approach to the use of blood flow in a different way than just looking at hypertrophy as you would normally do. I was curious about the relationship between the blood flow restriction and irritability. So my first question, Angel, was how did you define operationally irritability? How is that defined?
So irritability, I don't know that we necessarily defined it. Well, we did define it in terms of, there was a paper that we looked at that defined patients who had, let's call it subacromial impingement, which we know is kind of this loose term for diffuse shoulder pain. And so we looked at certain markers, and it had to do with like range of motion deficits. It had to do with difficulty completing ADLs. It had to do with relationships to strength. And so we felt that though, especially our 2 cases, they kind of fell into that high irritability because of the effects that their shoulder pain had on their day-to-day life. And so, for example, one of our cases, and I felt like hers was the more extreme case, she was having trouble with dressing and grooming. She was having difficulty with driving. She was having difficulty with things throughout her daily life. And so we kind of characterized that as high irritability, where our second case was more of a mild or medium irritability, because it wasn't affecting everyday activities, but it was affecting his recreational activities. It was affecting the things that he did, his participation activities of participation. And so we felt that those were kind of our defining, the way we define them. But I feel like, yeah, I feel like we see this pretty frequently with a lot of our cases, that they kind of fall into that middle ground where it could be medium or high. And I think that in both of those cases, using a device such as the BFR is something that will allow them, I think Rob touched on it a little bit, it allows us to sort of address that deficit in strength, whether that's a motor recruitment issue because of pain, right, that pain inhibition, or if it's a true deficit in strength. And so we found that using this with high irritability and medium irritability was something that kind of worked out for both of them.
Yeah, I did want to commend you too on the amount of good data you were taking in terms of all of the outcomes and then reporting on MCIDs. I think that's a really important thing that we need to move towards a lot more, and indicating where we don't have MCIDs. But I'll leave as a kind of a devil's advocate here in the placebo effect of this, because the outcomes that seem to do best were pain related, which is of course a subjective outcome. And so I was just curious if there would be any way that you could actually do a placebo controlled intervention with blood flow restriction, other than saying, don't inflate the cuff. Well, yeah, right. You know, we know, the patient knows. So I think that is a possible contribution to say that this, you know, this unit, this $5,000 unit, is it a placebo for that particular application? Oh, we just lost him.
Angel left.
Oh, well.
It's a tough question. That's the reason. So
Yeah, he just bailed. He said, "Okay, I'm out."
He was
that was
like,
enough.
I'm
Yeah.
Gosh,
out.
Phil.
I'm not answering that one.
I'll take you guys. What do you guys think?
Oh, yeah, Angel's back. Angel's back. Angel, we thought we thought the question was too hard, and you just said, "Hell with this, I'm leaving."
Yeah,
I didn't know they were going to ask me those kind of questions. I thought they were going to ask me the real simple stuff, like how many patients
I thought
did
I
we
was
have
getting
in
a
this
soft
case?
toss. I got
Yeah.
I got a 90-mile-an-hour fastball right down the middle. Sorry about that.
No worries. So did you get Phil's question, or did you
No,
pop
so
up?
I got the first part, and then it cut out. So if you could
You got all
repeat
the
the
good
last one.
stuff.
Yeah,
So
just
here's the hard part.
ask him real quick, Phil. It was about placebo.
So yeah, I'm curious about the placebo effect with this, because, and I'm not bashing BFR at all. I think it's great for, we have a lot of data, but when it comes to hypoalgesia with exercise, and you're looking at a subjective outcome like pain, I noticed that most of your improved outcomes were subjective related improvements. And so the question that I had was, how much of this could be placebo? And then is there any possible way for the panel to think how you could actually do a placebo-controlled intervention with blood flow restriction?
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that we considered in terms of our intervention, right? And that's kind of, we see that across the literature. I feel that where we see that it potentially would not be placebo is in that pain sensitization that we use through like the pain pressure thresholds. Even though that's subjective, right, you still see an objective number go up in that, right? And so I think it would be extremely difficult to find a way to make this a true placebo without just inflating the cuff and then deflating the cuff and not really doing a whole lot of exercise with that. But I still think even with the inflation of the cuff, if you're not really explaining to them what the purpose of the cuff is, I don't know that you would still be able to do that, even though we're seeing some data coming out now about like intermittent occlusion and just leaving the cuff on at 100% and then deflating and seeing changes in that. I just don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I'm curious as to what your guys' thoughts are in terms of how you would make that into
Yeah,
a
I think you
placebo.
could, because the patient doesn't, when you explain to them blood flow
Yeah.
restriction, they don't really know how constricted the cuff is. So if you could figure out a way that you just pump up the cuff a little bit, so they feel just a little pressure, but it's not actually occluding anything, that would work as control, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah, in terms of, I'm trying to think of what else we could use it. I'm trying to think from our data now. Everything pretty much was subjective, and I don't know what else you could use objectively other than looking at potentially like the hormonal cascade that occurs with BFR and seeing the changes in someone who does BFR with exercise and someone who doesn't. And I know they've done something similar to that in the lower extremity, but I don't know how else you would replicate that or how else you would change that.
You have any thoughts, George?
Not in regard to doing a placebo effect, but I do have a lot of questions when it's my turn.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh,
Yeah,
no.
Get ready, Angel.
Oh,
Angel,
Lord
you
have
did the
mercy.
study with Giorgio, right?
I did it with
Yeah.
Georgia.
Is he on tonight? Do you know, is he on? Maybe you could phone a friend.
Giorgio, come out.
Giorgio, are you here?
Hello. He might not be.
No,
they're
I can't
dealing-
believe
they're
he
dealing
wouldn't
with-
be on. Oh my
His
God,
power's
Giorgio.
probably out from the hurricane, so who
Oh,
knows?
that's true.
Who
That's
knows if
true.
he
You're
split
right.
it or not?
Yeah. Okay, George.
No
It's your
tough
turn.
ones. Again, I've also had an interest in BFR. Took Johnny Owen's course probably 7 or 8 years ago and been using it in the clinic regularly with many patients. Plus, we actually have a paper or an abstract submitted to CSM with some things similarly to what you're talking about. But some of the questions that came up is, number one, when you use when you establish your LOP,
Yep.
you did it all supine,
Yes, sir.
but most of the exercises were not done in that position.
They
And
were
in the
not.
last issue of Sports Health, there's an article in there that talks about the differences in the LOP based on how you take the resting pressures.
Yep.
So once again, I wonder, because now I used to do it all supine too, because that's the way it was originally taught.
Yep.
But if you're going to have somebody upstanding and working, or if you're going to have them seated doing different exercises,
Yeah,
whatever,
you need it.
so that's
done then, right?
something that I
Yeah.
think we need to really reconsider
Yeah.
from the traditional teachings.
Yep.
The other thing, even though there's thousands of articles on BFR, there's only 20 on the upper extremity right now. And interestingly, what you looked at specifically and what our paper is that we've submitted to CSM is looking at, you're putting the cuff obviously on the proximal humerus.
Yep.
Does it really overflow into because you're having the LOP distally, does
Mhm.
it really have a proximal overflow?
Yep.
Can it really affect proximal muscles if you're not occluding them? And again, if you look at the literature, and I just went back to that before this, and there's only about 6 papers and they're mixed. 2 papers by Brummett say there is no proximal overflow, whereas a couple of other papers say there is. The study that we did in fact find a proximal overflow from the training. But the paper we submitted, even more interestingly to me, because I do this in the clinic all the time, upper lower extremity, we put the BFR on the right shoulder and trained the right shoulder. But what I was interested in, is there a contralateral or a cross education effect? And what
Yep.
we were able to establish, there was a statistically significant improvement in the non-trained arm.
Mhm.
So is that one of those systemic effects that everybody talks about? So
And I think it is, right? I feel like there may not be a ton of literature supporting the systemic effect, but I think there's more and more coming out now in terms of showing that there is overflow to proximal, and it may just be that systemic effect. It may not be the direct occlusion and then reperfusion effect that you see in the distal muscles. But I do think that if you do it for potentially long enough, or you have a long enough session with doing BFR, I think that systemic response that makes sense, right? The harder you load or the longer that you're doing a workout, the more effect you have. And so I'm curious if they look at time under occlusion and seeing if that has any effect on cross education or changes from one side to the other or not.
So that may be why, there's a lot of speculation. There is some underlying, and on the chat, there just came up some of the reasons that have been postulated as to why. A couple of other things. One of your references, interestingly, you said BFR literature in the upper extremity shows improvements in strength for proximal shoulder muscles with less than 20% of 1 RM. And your reference that you cited is actually they train using unilateral leg press. I'm not sure how you extrapolated that up to the shoulder, but that's okay.
Yeah, that might have been, we might have
Just,
quoted the wrong one then.
Because I did look at all the references as well, because I'm trying to learn how we can do this better. When you talked about the volume of training, it was interesting because when you do your BFR, you did 3 exercises, I think, and then you look at your 75 load, it's 225 reps. And then when you did your home program stuff, it was 108 reps, looking at the numbers that you cited in the study.
Yes.
So again, is it really from the BFR, or is it really just the volume of loading that you were doing?
Exactly.
'Cause that's quite a bit. Furthermore, you found, some incredible changes, 87% improvement in horizontal abduction strength in 4 weeks.
Yep.
So is that really eliminating pain inhibition? Because in 4 weeks, you're not really getting any type
It's
of
gotta be.
hypertrophy.
Exactly.
You're not getting hypertrophy in 4 weeks.
we all
it's gotta
know
be
that.
some- Yeah.
So just some interesting things that I guess we still have a lot of dots to connect using BFR. And obviously, we all know with case series, it's a limited of N of 2.
Yeah.
But it's a great start. So my congratulations for trying to answer some of these questions. And I think to Phil's comment, you looked at a lot of subjective things because you used 4 PROs.
Yeah.
Is that part of it? That's
We
a
were
lot
trying
of
to cover
PROs. for one study.
Yeah, we were trying to cover a spectrum, and given that it is a case series, we were trying to get as much data, knowing that we only had 2 subjects to work with, and try to get as much information as possible, and then try to have a discussion about what of this is important, or what of this should be looked at further, or kind of which direction should we go in. And I think going back to like what you were saying in terms of the improvements in strength, I really don't think, like we've spoken about, I don't think it's a true change in strength. It might be a motor recruitment that we know that with BFR, we have an increase in motor recruitment. It might be the pain inhibition that leads to more motor recruitment. I think that's definitely something that I hope the literature sort of goes in that direction and kind of figures out what it is. And I think at the end of the day, clinically, it's something that we can use to do it. I don't know that necessarily our patients care if it's one way or the other. It's
Yeah, they
does the
don't. They're
pain
just
go
glad that
away or
they're
does it not
stronger
go
and
away?
their pain's less. That's
Yeah,
the most important factor. Yeah, and their patient-reported outcomes are improved.
Yeah, exactly.
And to Phil's point, with a lot of the data, it was great to see that. Although I guess I would check some of that, because you made a comment, some of the decreased shoulder strength by a handheld dynamometer for scaption, external rotation, internal rotation, et cetera. When you look at your data, frankly, the involved side was stronger than the uninvolved side.
For which one? For both of them?
Because you said there was decreased strength when you're testing. Yes. So again, I would just go back and look at subject B, and look at some of your data with that.
Okay.
Because what you describe in the description on subject B, and what's in your table are incongruent.
Gotcha.
So something just to look at.
Sounds good.
So-
Thank you.
But otherwise, as I said, I think it's we're all trying to learn, and this is it's a hot topic, just like the neurocognitive aspects were. So to me, this was an exciting type of a journal club, because boy, talk about trendy things.
Exactly.
Just final comment from me. What I've done this time is we're putting together the 2 trendy things. We're doing a BFR study, and we're measuring it with neurocognitive testing using the Blaze pods for closed and open kinetic chain. We just got our IRB approval. So we're putting the 2 hot, trendy things together.
I don't know.
You
that
know,
you
is
can
there
get
a
subjects
limit
to
on
that.
how many? Is there a limit on how many abstracts you can get to submit to CSM? Because George, I swear to God, he's told us
No,
he
we
submitted like 10.
We
Not if
just
you're
got
George
that.
Davies.
We
It's
just
10?
wrote that
There's 10?
IRB.
Yeah.
We just
If
got,
you're
we
George
just,
Davies, it's however many you want to put
I
in.
guess well, yeah, when you're the general, you can submit as many as you want. Yeah.
However
Nope.
many initials
Here.
behind your name you could submit.
we just got that approved with IRB. So we're starting the data collection. We did our pilots on it. So, but I thought that was
No,
kind of
we're
cool.
just giving you
Two
trouble. We're
sexy
just giving you
things
a
that are
hard time,
going on
George.
right now and try to see if they do make a difference.
Good stuff. Angel, there's a question from Doug on the chat. Effects of BFR in tendinopathies, etc., in the lower extremity is distal to the cuff. How does that differ in the upper extremity with symptomology proximal to the cuff? Do you have thoughts on what happens? And is there research on the effects proximal to the cuff versus distal to the cuff? I think George touched on that a little bit, but
Yeah.
Yes,
Can you
so
add to that at
whoever's
all?
listening, Brummett, Lambert, Bowman, and Dankel, they're all studies that have looked at the effects proximal with the BFR.
and you said Brummett, both Brummett studies said there wasn't
Yeah.
any, but the
Two-
other
two
two
Brummett
said there
studies.
is.
Bowman said there was.
Yeah. Matter of fact, there's one, an excellent study by Bowman in the journal Shoulder Elbow Surgery. And they basically showed there was proximal benefits from that. And they actually also showed a contralateral overflow. They use grip
Like
strength.
yours.
We use handheld dynamometry for shoulder. They did grip strength to reflect the entire upper extremity. So
Good.
whoever that question was, there, just do a PubMed search. You can find those articles and limit it just to BFR, shoulder, proximal overflow, or something like that, and you'll find them.
You're welcome. Doug said, thank you. You're welcome, Doug. So Angel, what was your, the three exercises you used? What was your rationale for using those three? Did you see those in other studies, or are they just three that were commonly used by, and who were you seeing these patients, or was it someone else that was seeing the
So-
patients? And
Yeah, so those were two patients that I evaled and sort of treated and got their consent to do
Okay.
BFR with them and told them kind of the benefits and the whole spiel. So they were ones that I saw from beginning to end. And the three exercises we chose, honestly, were based off of three that we kind of start out with at some point in what we consider shoulder chromial or subacromial impingement rehab. And so
just kind of
it was-
basic three
Yeah.
exercises you commonly use. And
Yep. And obviously they tie in sort of to, I mean, sideline external rotation was the first one, a prone T was the second one, and then scaption was the third one. And we felt like it was important to have three that they could do at home without minimal equipment, without any sort of supervision really needed. We didn't want to get too crazy with any of that exercise selection. And we wanted to try to keep it simple to see if those exercises were beneficial for these patients. And so obviously with those three, those are kind of bread and butter for shoulder rehab. I think we underload them in traditional rehab because these patients are so highly irritable, but it was something that with BFR and 20% of the load, they were able to handle just fine. They hated that little dinging noise at the beginning though. They thought it was like some sort of Pavlov's dog. Started to twitch at the end.
Angel, you had these patients were 3 and 4 visits.
Yep.
And so when they came in, walk me through what they did in the clinic on each visit.
So said hello to them, asked them how they were doing, how they felt after last time. Most of the time felt fine, less pain from beginning to end of the session. And then put them on the upper body ergometer. We tried to keep it as basic as possible, or sort of as normal as what you would do for some of these patients that weren't doing BFR. So we did upper body ergometer. Potentially we would kind of go through some range of motion and get the range of motion measurements in whatever position they felt. And then we would go through our handheld dynamometer. So we would do in seated, we would do internal and external, which looking back now, if we standardize this, I'd probably want to do it in the position that we were going to do the exercise in, right? If we're going to get 20% of their max, I want to do it in whatever position we're going to do the exercise in. But we did it in sitting, external, internal. Then we went standing, we did scaption, and we did abduction. And then we did prone, we did horizontal abduction. And then from there, we would turn on the machine, we would lay them supine, take the limb occlusion pressure, and then go through our exercises. So they would do sideline external first, then we would do prone T, and then we finished off with scaption. They would get about a minute break in between each exercise, and then we would kind of move on to the next one. And then at the end of the session, we would say, okay, so how do you feel? Get the pain pressure threshold. We would do that before BFR as well. And then kind of asked them if they had any questions about their HEP or if they had any questions about the session.
So you had no modalities, no manual therapy.
None.
And that's good because that takes away those confounders of other things that may have been doing it. So
Yep.
that adds a little bit more, to the potential benefits of what you did. And my last question will be what handheld dynamometer did you use? Because you didn't specify it.
Oh, I forgot the name. It's the handheld one. I mean, it's the circular one with the little red button. It's the best way I can describe it.
Microfit.
There you go. That one. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the one we use, and we took those measurements there.
Yeah, my recommendation, just make sure you put those in the papers.
Okay.
Where you described Delphi very well, but when
Yep.
it came to the other equipment.
Yeah,
so,
we had the pressure, the pain pressure threshold one as well.
I have
Yep.
the same one.
Yep.
Great. Okay. Well, unless anyone has any other questions, I think we will probably wrap this up. Thank you both, Wendy, Angel, for joining us. Ash, thanks for helping us get it all set up. Phil, as always, thanks, brother. George, General, I'll see you in a couple weeks.
Yes,
You looking forward to some magic?
I am.
You better be. George and I are going to Vegas in a couple weeks.
Even at
You're
our
not scared of
Looking forward to
puppets, are you? You're not scared
Yeah,
of
it's for a
puppets, are you?
conference. It's for a conference.
Right.
What?
Not scared of
Scared of-
puppets, are you?
I'm not scared. No, I'm not scared of puppets at all.
Speaking at the rehab summit. And in
Yes, the
evening, we
rehab
go
summit.
get some
Anyone
magic
that'd
foods.
like to go to Vegas, come join us. Yeah.
All right.
All
Well,
right,
thank
Ashley, do you need
um,
any closing comments?
Yeah,
Ash?
just thank you everyone for staying on. Again, certificates will be sent via email. If you don't get it or you have an issue, it's Campbell, CAMPBELL @ijspt.org. Please feel free to shoot me an email, and we will be soon blasting out not only the replay, but the next journal club, as well as the 2 specific articles we'll be reviewing. So
Yeah, I just looked it
Thanks
up, Ash. The next journal club is Wednesday, October 26th.
perfect. So we will soon be getting out the email about that and the signups, and we hope to see you all there. But thank you
Right.
for being here.
Thanks,
Thanks, guys.
everyone.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everybody.
everybody.
Take your time.
Thank
Wendy,
you.
Wendy,
great time.
great to
Thank
see
you.
you again.
Good to
Good
see
night.
you
Keep up
too,
the great
George.
work. Keep up the great work.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
See ya.